You think you know someone after 44 years. Every breath, every habit, every secret. You think marriage is a kind of archaeology, that over decades you excavate every layer of a person until there's nothing left to discover. I believed that. I believed I knew my husband, the way I knew the layout of our house in the dark, the way I knew which floorboard creaked near the bathroom, which drawer stuck in the kitchen. I was wrong. My name is Marlowe, though most people call me Lowe. I'm 66 years old, a retired school librarian, and as of 3 weeks ago, a widow. My husband Callum died on a Tuesday morning in early October. A stroke. No warning. He was pouring coffee, and then he wasn't. The paramedics came. The hospital called it massive and unsurvivable. By Wednesday afternoon, I was signing papers I didn't read and making phone calls I don't remember. By Thursday, I was a woman whose entire identity had been cleaved in half. We lived in Seattle, in the Queen Anne neighborhood, in a house we bought 38 years ago when the kids were small and the mortgage felt impossible. The house sits on a hill with a view of Puget Sound, and on clear days you can see the Olympics in the distance, blue and serrated against the sky. Callum loved that view. He'd stand at the kitchen window every morning with his coffee, looking out at the water like he was checking to make sure it was still there. I used to tease him about it. Now the coffee sits cold on the counter, and the view feels like an accusation. We had what everyone would call a good life. A perfect life, even. 2 children, Dashiell, who we call Dash, and Thessaly, who we call Thess. 4 grandchildren. Callum was a high school principal for 30 years, respected and loved by students and staff alike. I spent my career in the library at the elementary school, surrounded by books and small hands and the smell of old paper. We went to church every Sunday at Grace Harbor, where Callum served as a deacon. We hosted Sunday dinners. We voted in every election. We recycled. We were, by every measure, the kind of couple people point to and say, "That's what marriage should look like." And then he died, and the house became so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, fills the corners, makes the air thick. I moved through those first weeks like I was underwater. People brought casseroles. The kids came over every day. The church sent flowers. Everyone said the same things. "He's at peace now. He's with God. You'll get through this." But none of them could answer the question that kept me awake at night. How do you get through losing the person who was supposed to be there when you got through things? 4 days after the funeral, I was sitting in Callum's study. It's a small room off the living room, lined with bookshelves, smelling faintly of the pipe tobacco he quit smoking 20 years ago, but whose scent never quite left. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just wanted to be near his things. I picked up his Bible, the leather-bound one he'd carried for 30 years, its cover soft and creased from handling, the pages thin as tissue. He kept it on his desk, always within reach. I opened it to Psalms, his favourite, the place where the spine naturally fell open because he'd read those pages so many times. And that's when the photograph fell out. It landed face up on the desk, a Polaroid, the kind with the white border and the square shape that nobody uses anymore. The colours were faded, that washed-out quality old photos get, but the image was clear enough. A man and a woman standing in front of a cabin. The man was Callum, younger, maybe in his mid-40s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt I didn't recognize. His arm was around the woman's shoulders. She was beautiful. Dark hair, bright smile, leaning into him the way you lean into someone when you're comfortable, when you belong there. They looked happy. They looked like a couple. I didn't recognize her. I turned the photo over. On the back. In Callum's handwriting, I knew his handwriting the way I knew his voice, the slant of the letters, the way he looped his L's, were 4 words and a date. Liora, summer 1998, our place? The room tilted. I had to grip the edge of the desk to steady myself. 1998. We were married in 1998. We'd been married for 22 years by then. Dash was 16. Thess was 14. I was 42, teaching full-time, driving carpool, making dinner every night, doing laundry, living the life we'd built together. And Callum was… what? Standing in front of a cabin with a woman named Liora, calling it our place? My hands started shaking. I felt nauseous, the way you feel when you're in a car that stops too suddenly and your body doesn't catch up. I stared at the photo, trying to make it make sense, trying to find an innocent explanation. Maybe she was a colleague, maybe it was a work retreat, maybe our place meant something else, something benign, something I was misunderstanding. But I wasn't misunderstanding. The way his arm rested on her shoulders, the way she leaned into him, the way they were smiling. That wasn't the smile you give a colleague. That was intimacy. That was possession. That was love. I sat there for a long time, holding the photo, feeling the weight of it in my hands like it was made of something heavier than paper. The rain started outside, tapping against the windows, and the house felt even quieter than before. I thought about all the things I knew about Callum, the way he took his coffee, the way he hummed when he was concentrating, the way he reached for my hand in church during the hymns. And now, apparently, I had to add this, the way he kept a photo of another woman hidden in his Bible for 27 years. I tried to rationalize it. I'm good at that. Librarians are trained to organize chaos, to find patterns, to make sense of information. Maybe Liora was a friend. Maybe the photo was innocent and I was reading too much into it. Maybe our place referred to a group of people, a shared space, something communal. But even as I thought these things, I knew they weren't true. You don't hide innocent photos in your Bible. You don't write our place about something that doesn't matter. I got up and started searching. I went through his desk drawers, pulling out files and folders, looking for letters, emails, anything that would explain who Liora was. I found tax returns and old report cards and a birthday card I'd given him in 1987. I went to the bedroom and searched his closet, his dresser, the shoebox where he kept cufflinks and old watches. I went down to the basement and opened boxes we hadn't touched in years, Christmas decorations, old textbooks, photo albums from before we had digital cameras. I looked through every album, every loose photo, searching for her face. I found nothing. Just that one Polaroid, hidden in the one place I'd never think to look because it was too sacred, too personal, too much a part of who Callum was. The isolation of that single photo made it worse. If there had been letters, if there had been other pictures, it would have been evidence of something concrete, something I could name and confront. But one photo, hidden for decades, felt like a splinter I couldn't remove. It raised more questions than it answered. Who was she? What happened between them? Why did he keep this one image? And the question that made my chest tighten every time I thought it. Did my children know? I stood in the basement, surrounded by boxes and dust and the smell of old cardboard, and I realized I couldn't ask them. What if they did know? What if this was a secret the 3 of them had kept from me, a shared knowledge that I was the only one excluded from? It would mean my entire family had been lying to me. And what if they didn't know? What if I told them and it shattered their memory of their father, turned him from the man they loved into someone they couldn't recognize. I couldn't do that to them. Not yet. Not until I knew what I was dealing with. I called Odette. She's been my best friend since we were 23. Since we met at a teacher training seminar and bonded over bad coffee and a shared hatred of icebreakers. She's a widow, too. Her husband died 6 years ago. And she's the only person I know who understands what it's like to lose the person you built your life around. She came over within 20 minutes, still in her gardening clothes, smelling like soil and lavender. I handed her the photo without saying anything. She looked at it, turned it over, read the back, and then looked at me. Her face did something I'd never seen before, a kind of careful blankness, like she was trying not to react too strongly. She set the photo down on the kitchen table and sat across from me. "Lo," she said quietly, "you need to find out who she is." Her words hung in the air between us. I could have said no. I could have taken the photo, burned it, pretended I'd never found it. I could have chosen to let Callum keep his secrets, to preserve the version of him I'd always known, to protect the life we'd built from this intrusion of the past. But I didn't. Because the truth is, the moment I saw that photo, the life I thought I had was already gone. The marriage I believed in was already fractured. The man I thought I knew was already a stranger. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, our bed, the one we'd shared for 44 years, and stared at the ceiling. I got up around 2 in the morning and went back to Callum's study. I sat at his desk and opened my laptop and typed Liora, Seattle, 1998 into Google. I got nothing useful. A few LinkedIn profiles, a genealogy site, a random blog post. None of it connected to Callum. None of it explained the photo. Then I remembered something. Callum kept day planners, old-fashioned ones, the kind with leather covers and pages you write on by hand. He'd kept them for decades, long after everyone else switched to digital calendars. He said he liked the physicality of writing things down, the ritual of it. I'd teased him about being old-fashioned, but he never stopped. I went to his office closet and found them on the top shelf, stacked in a cardboard box. Leather-bound planners going back to 1995. I pulled out the one labelled 1998 and sat down on the floor with it. The pages smelled like dust and old ink. I flipped to June. The entries were mundane. Faculty meetings, dentist appointments, Dash's soccer games, Thess's piano recital. But every Friday, from early June through mid-August, there was a small notation in the corner of the page. Just the letter V, nothing else. No explanation, no context. Just V. 7 Fridays in a row. Then nothing. I flipped to the back of the planner, where there was a small pocket for business cards and receipts. Tucked inside was a single card, yellowed with age. Whispering Pines Cabin Rentals, San Juan Islands. A phone number. An address. My heart stopped. A cabin. The cabin in the photo. The place Callum had called ours. I sat on the floor of his office, holding the planner and the business card, and I felt something shift inside me. The grief I'd been carrying for 3 weeks was still there, but now it was tangled up with something else. Anger, betrayal, confusion, and underneath it all, a cold, clear determination. I was going to find out who Liora was. I was going to find out what happened in the summer of 1998. I was going to find out whether the man I'd spent 44 years with, the man I'd buried 3 weeks ago, the man I'd loved more than anyone in the world, had been lying to me the entire time. I was going to find the truth, no matter what it cost me. I found Kestrel Reyes through a recommendation from a friend of Odette's, someone who'd used her services during a messy divorce and said she was thorough, discreet, and didn't waste time with platitudes. Her office was in a building near Pike Place Market, up 3 flights of narrow stairs that smelled like coffee and old wood. The door had her name stenciled in simple black letters. Kestrel Reyes, Private Investigations. I stood outside for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, wondering if I was really going to do this. Wondering if hiring someone to investigate my dead husband made me paranoid, or justified, or just desperately sad. I opened the door. Kestrel was younger than I expected. Mid-40s, maybe, with short dark hair and the kind of direct gaze that made you feel like she could see through whatever story you were about to tell. She didn't smile when she shook my hand, but she wasn't cold either, just professional. She gestured to a chair across from her desk, and I sat down, clutching my purse in my lap like it could anchor me. I laid out everything I had: the photo, the day planner with the V notations, the business card from Whispering Pines Cabin Rentals. She examined each item carefully, turning the photo over to read the back, running her finger down the planner pages, holding the business card up to the light like it might reveal something I'd missed. When she finally looked up at me, her expression was unreadable. "Mrs. Tennyson," she said, "before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Do you want to know the truth, even if it destroys everything?" The question landed like a stone in my chest. I thought about Callum's funeral, the way our children had stood on either side of me, holding me up. I thought about the grandchildren, the way they'd cried when they saw the casket. I thought about the life we'd built, the story we'd told ourselves and everyone else about who we were. And then I thought about that photo, hidden in his Bible for 27 years, and the way it had already destroyed everything, whether I wanted it to or not. "Yes," I said, "no matter what." She nodded, like she'd expected that answer, and pulled out a legal pad. She explained her process. She'd start with the cabin rental company, try to track down records from 1998, see if there were any other names associated with the reservation. She'd search for Liora in Seattle area records, cross-reference with the school district since Callum had been a principal. She'd be thorough. But I needed to understand that investigations like this took time, and they didn't always lead where you expected. "Secrets this old usually have layers," she said, her pen poised over the pad. "Be prepared for what we might find." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could be prepared for anything. She quoted me a rate, hourly, plus expenses, and I wrote her a check without hesitation. Money felt irrelevant. What was I going to do? Save it for retirement? I was already living the worst version of my future. She said she'd be in touch within a week, maybe sooner if she found something quickly. I thanked her and left, walking back down those narrow stairs into the noise and smell of the market, feeling like I'd just set something in motion that I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. Sunday dinner had always been Callum's tradition. He'd started it when the kids were small, insisting that no matter how busy we got, we'd sit down together once a week. Even after Dash and Thess moved out, got married, had kids of their own, we kept it going. Every Sunday at 5, they'd come to the house with their families, and we'd crowd around the table, passing dishes and telling stories, and pretending the world outside didn't exist for a few hours. The first Sunday after Callum died, I'd cancelled. I couldn't imagine sitting at that table with his chair empty, but Thess had called and said we needed to keep the tradition going, that it's what Dad would have wanted, and I didn't have the energy to argue. So that Sunday, a week after I'd hired Kestrel, I made a roast and set the table and waited for everyone to arrive. Dash and Isolde came first, with Bryony and Caspian trailing behind. Bryony is 16, all long limbs and dark eyes, already taller than her mother. Caspian is 14, quieter, the kind of kid who notices everything but doesn't say much. Tess and Gian arrived a few minutes later with Eloan and Freya, who are 12 and 9 and still young enough to fill a room with noise and energy. They hugged me, one by one, and I felt the weight of their grief pressing against mine, all of us trying to hold each other up. We sat down to eat, and for a while it almost felt normal. Dash talked about a project he was working on, some building downtown that was giving him trouble with the permits. Isolde mentioned the memorial fund they were setting up in Callum's name, something to help students who couldn't afford college application fees. Tess cried when she looked at Callum's empty chair, and Gian put his arm around her, and the kids got quiet the way kids do when they realize the adults are struggling. I watched them all, searching their faces for something I couldn't name. Did they know? Had Callum ever told them about Liora? Confided in them the way parents sometimes do when their children are grown? Did Dash know? Did Tess? Were they sitting here, eating my food, pretending everything was fine, while carrying a secret they'd agreed never to tell me? Or were they as ignorant as I'd been, believing in the version of their father that I'd believed in, the one that was now crumbling in my hands? Dash mentioned that he'd been to Callum's office at the high school, sorting through his things. The school wanted to clear out the space for the new principal, and Dash had volunteered to handle it. He said there were boxes of old files, plaques, photos, things Callum had accumulated over 30 years. He asked if I wanted him to bring them to the house, and I said yes, even though the thought of going through more of Callum's belongings made me feel sick. I almost told them. I almost pulled the photo out of my purse and laid it on the table and said, "Do you know who this is?" But I stopped myself. What if they didn't know? What if I shattered their memory of their father right here? In the middle of dinner, surrounded by children who still thought their grandfather was a hero? I couldn't do that. Not yet. Not until I knew what I was dealing with. Bryony noticed. She's perceptive, the way teenage girls often are, attuned to shifts in mood and unspoken tension. She looked at me across the table and said, "Grandma, are you okay? You seem different." I forced a smile. "Just missing Grandpa," I said. And it wasn't entirely a lie. I was missing him. I was missing the version of him I thought I knew, the one who would have sat at the head of this table and made terrible jokes and asked the kids about school. I was missing the certainty I used to have, the belief that I understood my own life. After they left, after the dishes were washed and the house was quiet again, I sat at the kitchen table with the photo in front of me. The rain had started again, tapping against the windows, and the house felt enormous and empty. I traced the edges of the Polaroid with my finger and whispered, "Who were you, Callum? Who were you, really?" Kestrel called 5 days later. I was in the garden, pulling weeds that didn't need pulling, trying to keep my hands busy. I answered on the second ring, my heart already racing. She'd found the records from Whispering Pines Cabin Rentals. Cabin number 7 had been rented every Friday from June 5th through August 14th, 1998, 10 consecutive weeks. The renter's name was Callum Tennyson. Payment had been made in cash, which meant there was no credit card trail, no bank record, nothing that would have shown up in our joint account. He'd been careful, deliberate. The current owner of Whispering Pines wasn't the same person who'd run it in 1998, but Kestrel had tracked down the original owner, a man named Gerald, who was now retired and living in Bellingham. She'd called him, and he remembered them. "Nice couple," he'd said. Quiet, kept to themselves. The woman had dark hair, laughed a lot. They seemed in love. I felt the nausea rise in my throat, sharp and immediate. In love. Not an affair. Not a mistake. In love. Kestrel kept talking. She'd been searching for anyone named Liora in Seattle area records from that time period. She'd found 3 possibilities, but one stood out. Liora Castellan, age 32, in 1998, who had worked as a music teacher at Roosevelt High School. Not Callum's school, but in the same district. They would have crossed paths at meetings, conferences, district events. That's probably how they met. 32. Callum had been 46 in 1998, 14 years younger. I thought about what I'd been at 32, still figuring out who I was, still learning how to be a mother and a wife and a professional all at once. And Callum, at 46, established and confident and respected, would have seemed like everything she wanted. Or maybe I was projecting. Maybe she was the one who pursued him. Maybe it didn't matter who started it. Kestrel's voice changed, became more careful. Marlowe, there's something else. I found a death certificate. Liora Castellan died in 2003. Car accident on Highway 20 near the North Cascades. She was 37. The world went quiet. Dead. Liora was dead. Had been dead for 20 years. Which meant Callum had kept that photo, hidden in his Bible, for 2 decades after she was gone. Why? Why hold on to a memory of someone who was already lost? Why carry that grief in secret, never telling anyone, never asking for comfort or understanding? I thanked Kestrel and hung up. I sat in the garden, surrounded by weeds and rain and the smell of wet earth, and I tried to process what I'd just learned. The affair was real. The woman was real, and she was gone, which somehow made it worse. I couldn't confront her. I couldn't ask her what happened, why it happened, whether she'd loved him the way he'd apparently loved her. She was just a ghost now, a name on a death certificate, a face in a faded Polaroid. I called Odette. I told her everything Kestrel had found, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Lo, do you want to see the cabin?" I hadn't thought about it, but as soon as she said it, I knew the answer was yes. I needed to see the place where it had happened. I needed to stand where they'd stood, to understand what had drawn Callum there, what had made him carve out this secret life away from me and the kids and everything we'd built together. We drove to Anacortes on a grey Tuesday morning and took the ferry to the San Juan Islands. The water was choppy, the sky low and heavy with clouds, and I stood on the deck watching Seattle's skyline fade behind us. Odette stood next to me, not saying much, just being there the way good friends do when words aren't enough. Whispering Pines was still there, tucked into the trees on the western side of the island. It looked smaller than I'd imagined, more rustic, a cluster of cabins with weathered wood siding and stone chimneys, surrounded by Douglas firs and the smell of salt water. The current owner, a woman in her 50s named Diane, met us at the main office. I'd called ahead and explained that my late husband had rented a cabin here years ago, and I wanted to see it for sentimental reasons. It wasn't entirely a lie. Cabin number 7 was at the end of a gravel path, set back from the others, private. Diane unlocked the door and let us in, then left us alone. The interior was small and simple. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchenette, a bedroom barely big enough for a double bed. The windows overlooked the water, grey and restless under the cloudy sky. It was the kind of place that would feel romantic if you were there with someone you loved, intimate and removed from the rest of the world. I walked out onto the porch, and that's when I recognized it. The railing, the trees in the background. This was where the photo had been taken. I stood in the exact spot where Callum had stood, where Liora had leaned into him, where someone, maybe a stranger, maybe a timer, had captured that moment of happiness. I closed my eyes and imagined them here. Callum laughing, younger, unburdened by the weight of the secret he'd carry for the next 25 years. Liora, with her dark hair and bright smile, believing, maybe, that this was the beginning of something instead of a summer that would end and leave her alone. And me, back in Seattle, making dinner for our teenage children, folding laundry, planning the next week's lessons, completely unaware that my husband was living a second life every Friday, 2 hours away by car and ferry. Odette called my name softly. She was crouched by the porch railing, running her fingers over the wood. I walked over and saw what she'd found. Initials carved into the railing, barely visible, worn smooth by years of weather. CT plus LC 1998. I traced the letters with my finger, feeling the grooves, the permanence of them. He'd carved their initials. He'd marked this place, claimed it, made it theirs in a way that couldn't be erased. And then he'd gone home to me, to our children, to the life we were building. And he'd never said a word. I started to cry. Not the angry, bitter tears I'd expected, but something deeper, more complicated. I was crying for the betrayal, yes, but also for the love Callum had clearly felt for this woman. A love strong enough to carve into wood. A love he'd kept hidden for 25 years, even after she died. Even when there was no one left to protect or hurt. What kind of love does that? What kind of grief? We took the ferry back as the afternoon light began to fade. I stood on the deck again, watching the islands recede, and I felt something shift inside me. I'd come here looking for answers, but all I'd found were more questions. Who was Liora, really? How had she died? And why had Callum never told me, never asked for forgiveness or understanding? Never let me into the part of his heart that belonged to her? I needed to know everything. Not just the facts, but the story, the why behind the what. And I needed to know if the man I'd loved for 44 years had been capable of that kind of deception, or if there was something I was missing, some piece of the puzzle that would make it all make sense. I didn't know if I'd find those answers. But I knew I couldn't stop looking. When I got home from the San Juan Islands, there was an envelope taped to my front door. Not in the mailbox, not slipped under the door. Taped directly to the wood, at eye level, like someone had wanted to make sure I couldn't miss it. There was no postage, no return address. Just my name, Marlo Tennyson, typed in plain black letters across the front. I pulled it off and went inside, my hands already shaking. I didn't know why. Maybe because after everything I'd learned in the past 2 weeks, I'd started to expect that every new piece of information would be worse than the last. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened the envelope carefully, like it might contain something dangerous. Inside was a handwritten letter, 3 pages on lined notebook paper. The kind of careful cursive that suggested someone had taken their time. It was signed at the bottom, CR. I started reading. Mrs. Tennyson, I knew your husband and Liora. I've debated for years whether to tell you this. Now that Callum is gone, you deserve the truth. My breath caught. VR knew Callum, knew Liora, had been debating for years. Which meant this person had been carrying this secret, watching me from some unknown distance, deciding whether or not I had the right to know what had happened in my own marriage. The letter continued. VR explained that they had been Liora's best friend, that Callum and Liora had met at a district-wide teacher conference in the spring of 1998, one of those mandatory professional development events that Callum used to complain about, saying they were a waste of time. Apparently, This one hadn't been. The attraction between them had been immediate, intense, undeniable. They'd tried to resist it, VR wrote, but they couldn't. The Friday cabin rentals at Whispering Pines had been their escape, the place where they could be together without the weight of the real world pressing down on them. Liora loved him desperately, the letter said, but she also hated herself for it. She knew he was married, knew about you and the kids. It tore her apart. I read that line 3 times. She hated herself for it. I'd spent the past 2 weeks imagining Liora as someone careless, someone who'd seen a married man and decided she didn't care about the damage she might cause. But this was different. This was a woman who'd been in love and in agony at the same time, caught between what she wanted and what she knew was right. I didn't want to feel sympathy for her. I wanted to stay angry. But the anger was starting to crack, and underneath it was something more complicated. Then I got to the next line, and the world tilted again. In August 1998, Liora discovered she was pregnant. I set the letter down. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold it steady. Pregnant. Liora had been pregnant, which meant I couldn't finish the thought. I picked the letter back up and kept reading, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. VR explained that Liora had told Callum about the pregnancy in late August. He'd been devastated, torn between 2 lives, 2 loves, 2 versions of himself that couldn't coexist. He loved Liora. VR was clear about that, unflinchingly clear. But he also loved his family. He loved me. He loved Dash and Thess. And he couldn't leave us. He couldn't walk away from the life we'd built, the promises he'd made, the people who depended on him. Liora had understood. That's what VR wrote. She'd understood that Callum couldn't choose her, and she hadn't wanted him to. She'd made the decision for both of them. She would end the affair and handle the pregnancy alone. She didn't want to destroy his family. Callum had begged her to let him help, to stay in contact, to let him be part of the child's life in some way. But Liora had refused. She'd said a clean break was the only way. If they stayed in touch, it would only prolong the pain, make it harder for both of them to move on. In September 1998, Liora had transferred to a school in Spokane, on the other side of the state. She'd cut off all contact, changed her phone number, stopped responding to letters. VR wrote that Callum had tried to reach her, had driven to Spokane once and been turned away. Eventually, he'd stopped trying. Or maybe he'd just accepted that Liora had made her choice, and he had to live with it. She had the baby in April 1999, the letter said. A daughter. She named her Vera. I dropped the letter. It fluttered to the table, and I stared at it like it was something alive, something that might reach out and hurt me if I touched it again. A daughter. Callum had a daughter. Another daughter. A child he'd never known, never held, never watched grow up. And I had a stepdaughter I'd never known existed. Dash and Thess had a half-sister. Vera, VR. The initials clicked into place. The V notations in Callum's day planner. Not a code, a name. The name of the child he'd lost before she was even born. I forced myself to pick up the letter again. My hands were steadier now, or maybe I was just numb. Vera, continued her story, and with every line the tragedy deepened. Liora had raised Vera alone in Spokane. She'd never married, never told Vera who her father was. She'd only said that he was a good man who couldn't be part of their lives, and that it wasn't his fault. Vera had grown up with that absence, that unanswered question, the shape of a father she'd never meet. In 2003, when Vera was 4 years old, Liora had died in a car accident on Highway 20, near the North Cascades. I already knew that part. Kestrel had found the death certificate. But what I hadn't known, what Vera was telling me now, was why Liora had been on that road. She'd been driving back from Seattle. She'd been trying to see Callum one last time, to tell him about Vera, to give him a choice about whether he wanted to be part of his daughter's life. She'd never made it. The accident had happened on a curve in the road, late at night, in the rain. She'd died instantly. Vera had gone into foster care. 4 years old, her mother dead, no father listed on the birth certificate, no family to take her in. She'd been moved from home to home, the way kids in the system often are, never staying anywhere long enough to feel like she belonged. At 18, Vera had found her mother's journals. Liora had written everything down: the affair, the pregnancy, the decision to leave, the years of raising Vera alone, the plan to finally tell Callum the truth. And in those journals, Vera had learned her father's name, Callum Tennyson. She'd tracked him down. It hadn't been hard. He was still a principal, still living in Seattle, still part of the same community he'd always been part of. She'd watched him from a distance, seen him at school events, at church, at the grocery store. She'd seen his life, his family, his career, his reputation. She'd seen me. She'd seen Dash and Thess. She'd seen the grandchildren, the Sunday dinners, the intact world that Callum had chosen over her and her mother, and she'd decided not to destroy it. "I'm 24 now," Vera wrote. "I've lived my whole life knowing my father, but never meeting him. When I heard he died, I realized you deserved to know the truth. I'm not asking for anything. I just thought you should know I exist." The letter ended there. No phone number, no address. Just those words: I exist. I sat at the kitchen table for hours, reading the letter over and over, trying to absorb what it meant. My entire marriage had been reframed. Callum hadn't just been unfaithful. He'd been a father to a child he never knew. A child who'd grown up in foster care, who'd spent her whole life watching him from afar, longing for a connection she'd never been able to claim. And Liora, she wasn't the villain I'd wanted her to be. She was a woman who'd loved so much that she'd sacrificed everything, including her own life, trying to do the right thing. I felt a storm of emotions, all of them contradictory, all of them true at the same time. Betrayal, yes. Grief, absolutely. Anger at Callum for keeping this secret, for carrying it alone instead of trusting me with it. But also something I hadn't expected: compassion. For Liora, who'd tried so hard to protect my family even as her own life fell apart. For Vera, who'd been abandoned by circumstances beyond her control and had somehow found the grace not to seek revenge. And even for Callum, who'd carried this grief for 25 years, who'd lived with the knowledge that he had a daughter out there somewhere and couldn't reach her, couldn't help her, couldn't even acknowledge her existence. I called Odette. She answered on the first ring, like she'd been waiting. I read her the letter, my voice shaking, stumbling over the words. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, she said, "Lo, what are you going to do?" I didn't know. That was the honest answer. I could ignore this. I could take the letter, burn it, pretend I'd never found the photo in Callum's Bible, never hired Kestrel, never gone to the cabin. I could let Vera remain a stranger, a ghost, a name on a piece of paper. I could protect the version of my life that I'd always believed in, even though I now knew it was incomplete. Or I could reach out. I could meet this young woman who shared Callum's blood, who carried his loss the way I carried mine. I could give her the father she'd never had, even if only in stories and memories. I could let her into the family she'd been excluded from, not by choice, but by circumstance and secrecy, and a series of decisions that no one had made lightly. I told Odette I needed time to think. She said she understood, and we hung up. But I didn't think. Instead, I went to the closet where I kept the photo albums, the old ones from before everything was digital, when we still printed pictures and arranged them in books with plastic sleeves. I pulled out the albums from 1998 and 1999 and spread them across the living room floor. I found pictures of Callum from that time. Summer 1998, a family barbecue, Callum at the grill, smiling but distracted. Fall 1998, Dash's soccer game, Callum on the sidelines, his face shadowed in a way I'd never noticed before. Winter 1998, Christmas morning, all of us around the tree, and Callum's smile not quite reaching his eyes. Spring 1999, Thess's piano recital, Callum in the audience, clapping, but there was something hollow about it, something absent. I saw it now. The sadness, the weight. He'd been grieving Liora and a daughter he'd never meet, and he'd been doing it silently, privately, while sitting at the dinner table with the family he'd chosen to keep. Every smile had been an effort. Every normal moment had been a performance. And I'd never noticed, because I'd had no reason to look for it. I thought about the photo in his Bible. For weeks, I'd assumed he'd kept it out of nostalgia, or selfishness, or some lingering attachment to a woman he'd loved. But now I understood. It wasn't nostalgia. It was penance. A reminder of the love he'd lost and the child he'd abandoned, even if the abandonment hadn't been his choice. It was his private grief, his secret shame, the thing he carried alone because he believed he had to. And now it was mine. I'd inherited his burden, his secret, his unfinished story. I could carry it the way he had, silently, privately, letting it weigh me down for the rest of my life. Or I could do something different. I could reach out to Vera. I could tell her about her father, give her the pieces of him that she'd never had. I could let her know that she wasn't alone, that she'd never been alone, that there was a family here who would have loved her if they'd known she existed. I didn't know if I was strong enough to do that. I didn't know if Dash and Thess would understand, or if they'd see it as a betrayal of their father's memory. I didn't know if Vera even wanted to hear from me, or if she'd sent that letter as a way of closing the door, not opening it. But I knew one thing. I couldn't let this story end the way Callum's had, with secrets and silence and a grief that no one else could see. If there was a chance to heal this, to turn something broken into something whole, I had to try. I picked up the letter again and read the last line one more time. I exist. 2 words, but they carried the weight of 24 years. Vera wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't demanding recognition or apologies or a place at the table. She was simply claiming space in the world, saying that her life mattered, that her story was real, that she deserved to be known. And she was right. She did exist. And now that I knew, I couldn't pretend otherwise. I wrote back to Vera. It took me 3 days to figure out what to say, how to say it, whether I even had the right words for a moment like this. In the end, I kept it simple. I wanted to meet her. I suggested a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, a place that was neutral, public, somewhere neither of us had history. She responded within hours. Yes. Saturday at 2. I arrived early, too nervous to sit still at home. I chose a table near the window where I could watch people walk by, where I could see her coming before she saw me. I rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd introduce myself, whether I should hug her or shake her hand, or just sit down and let the moment unfold on its own. None of it felt right. How do you greet someone who's both a stranger and family, someone whose existence rewrites everything you thought you knew about your own life? Then she walked in, and my breath caught. She looked like Callum, not in an obvious way. Her features were softer, more delicate, clearly her mother's, but in the details, the eyes, the way she smiled, tentative and a little uncertain, the way she tilted her head when she scanned the room looking for me, the same gesture Callum used to make when he was thinking through a problem. I stood up, and she saw me. And for a moment, we just looked at each other across the crowded coffee shop, two women connected by a man who was gone, and a secret that had lived longer than it should have. She walked over, 24 years old, wearing jeans and a sweater, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that made me think she'd learned early how to take up only the space she was given. We sat down. It was awkward at first, the way these things always are. Small talk about the weather, about traffic, about whether she wanted something to drink. Then I took a breath and said the only thing that felt true. "Tell me about your mother." Her face softened. The guardedness that had been there since she walked in eased, just a little, and she started to talk. She told me about Liora, about her kindness, her love of music, the way she could make a room feel warmer just by being in it. She told me how Liora had worked 2 jobs to support them, teaching music during the day and waiting tables at night, never complaining, never making Vera feel like a burden. She told me that Liora had never spoken bitterly about Vera's father, had only said that he was a good man, caught in an impossible situation, and that some kinds of love don't get to have happy endings. I listened, tears streaming down my face, and I realized I was grieving for a woman I'd never met, grieving for the life she'd lived, the sacrifices she'd made, the love she'd carried alone. Vera's voice was steady, but I could hear the loss underneath it, the shape of a mother she'd had for only 4 years and had spent the rest of her life trying to hold on to. When she finished, I said, "Tell me about you." She told me about foster care, about being moved from home to home, never quite belonging anywhere, always feeling like she was waiting for something she couldn't name. She told me about getting a scholarship to college, about studying music education because it was the closest she could get to her mother. She told me about becoming a teacher, about standing in front of a classroom for the first time, and feeling like she'd finally found the place she was supposed to be. Then she pulled out her phone and showed me a photo. It was old, printed, and then photographed again, the colours faded. Liora holding baby Vera, both of them in a small apartment with sunlight coming through the window. Liora was smiling, looking down at Vera with an expression I recognized because I'd felt it myself when my own children were born. That overwhelming, terrifying, all-consuming love that makes you understand what it means to be responsible for another person's entire world. I looked at that photo, and I understood. This wasn't a sordid affair. This wasn't some reckless mistake or selfish indulgence. This was love. Complicated, painful, impossible love. The kind that doesn't fit into neat categories, that doesn't have easy answers, that leaves everyone involved carrying something they can't put down. I reached across the table and took Vera's hand. Her fingers were cold, and I held them between mine, trying to warm them, trying to communicate something I didn't have words for yet. "You're not alone anymore," I said. She started to cry. So did I. And we sat there in that coffee shop, 2 women who'd been shaped by the same man's choices, holding on to each other like we were the only solid things in a world that had shifted beneath us. I called a family meeting. Dash and Isolde came, confused and worried. Thess and Gian came. thinking maybe I was sick, maybe something was wrong with the house, maybe I needed help with Callum's estate. I waited until everyone was sitting in the living room, the same room where we'd gathered after the funeral, and then I showed them the photo. I read them Vera's letter. I told them everything. The room erupted. Dash was on his feet, furious, his face red in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. Dad cheated? Had another kid? How could he do that to you? To us? Thess was crying, her hands over her face, her whole body shaking. Isolde looked uncomfortable, like she wanted to be anywhere but here. Gian stayed quiet, his hand on Thess's shoulder, his expression unreadable. I let them react. I let them be angry and hurt and confused, because they had every right to those feelings. Then I said, as calmly as I could, "Your father made a mistake, but he also made a choice. He chose us. He stayed. He raised you. He loved you. And now we have a chance to do what he couldn't. We can welcome Vera into this family." Dash shook his head. "She's not family. She's evidence of Dad's betrayal." Thess looked up, her face streaked with tears. "She's our sister. She didn't ask for any of this." The room divided. Dash and Isolde on one side, angry and protective of the father they'd thought they knew. Thess and Gian on the other, already starting to see Vera as a person, not just a problem. I stood in the middle and said the only thing I knew to be true. "I'm meeting with Vera. I'm getting to know her. You can join me or not, but I won't let her be abandoned twice." The silence that followed was heavy, but I didn't break it. I'd said what I needed to say. The rest was up to them. 3 days later, Thess called. "I want to meet her." A week after that, Bryony, Dash's 16-year-old daughter, sent me a text. "Grandma, I want to meet my aunt." Slowly, carefully, the family began to open. Over the following weeks, Vera and I met regularly. Coffee at the same shop in Capitol Hill. Walks around Green Lake, where the water was grey and still, and the trees were starting to lose their leaves. Dinners at my house, where I cooked too much food because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I told her stories about Callum, his terrible jokes that no one ever laughed at but him, his love of jazz, the way he'd play Miles Davis on Sunday mornings and pretend to conduct, his dedication to his students, the way he'd stay late to help kids who were struggling, the way he believed everyone deserved a second chance. Vera listened like she was starving. She asked questions, wanted details, collected pieces of the father she'd never known, and tried to assemble them into something whole. Theus joined us, tentative at first, then warmer. Bryony came, curious and open in the way only teenagers can be. Even Dash softened eventually, not all at once, but in small increments, like he was testing whether it was safe to let go of his anger. 6 weeks after I found the photo, I invited Vera to Thanksgiving dinner. The whole family would be there, and I told her she didn't have to come if it was too much, too soon. But she said yes. She wanted to try. It was awkward at first. Everyone was too polite, too careful, like we were all walking on glass. But then Vera brought out a loaf of pumpkin bread, still warm, wrapped in a kitchen towel. "It's my mother's recipe," she said quietly. Thess took a bite and started to cry. Not sad tears, but something else. Recognition, maybe, or connection. The bread was sweet and spiced and tasted like someone had put love into it. And for a moment, we all felt Liora there with us, a presence we'd never known but could finally acknowledge. Dash asked Vera about teaching, and they discovered they both loved architecture and music. That they could talk for hours about the way buildings and songs were both about structure and emotion. By the end of the night, Vera was laughing with her nieces and nephews, and I stood in the kitchen watching them, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something new, something we'd built together out of the broken pieces Callum had left behind. A few days later, Vera and I drove to the cemetery. It was a cold morning, the kind where your breath fogs in the air and the ground is hard under your feet. We stood in front of Callum's grave, and I said, out loud, the words I'd been practicing in my head. Callum, this is your daughter. Her name is Vera. She's brilliant and kind and strong, just like her mother. I wish you'd known her. But I'm grateful I do. Vera placed flowers on the grave, white roses, simple and clean. We stood there in silence for a long time, and then we walked away together, side by side, leaving the past behind and moving toward whatever came next. I found a photo in my husband's Bible, and my world fell apart. But from those broken pieces, I built something new, a bigger family, a deeper understanding of love's complexity, a relationship with a remarkable young woman who deserved to be known. Secrets destroy, but truth, no matter how painful, can heal. And sometimes, the hardest thing you'll ever do is also the thing that saves you.